Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Coffee Break. This is Steve Barrett. I'm the editorial director of PR Week, and I'm delighted to be here with Margenett Moore-Roberts, who's the new Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Constituency Management Group, which is the part of Interpublic that looks after a bunch of PR firms that you'll know very well, called Weber Shandwick and Golin, as well as some experiential events and other firms. And relatively new in post. So Margenett, welcome to the show and congrats on the new role.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And you came to, it wasn't really a move of company, was it? Because you were already at Golin doing a similar role, and then you sort of joined this small centralized team that Andy Polanski's been putting together at CMG. Tell us a little bit about that role and what you are hoping to achieve there and what the idea is behind it.
Sure. So you're right. I joined Golin in May of 2018 as their first Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer. And I spent, about 18 months there working very closely with Matt and, Gary and the entire executive board to establish a framework and a strategy around inclusion and diversity for Golin. I think a couple of significant things happened that, within the larger context of CMG. Andy was appointed as the new CEO there, and he had a vision for what he wanted to do with CMG and wanted it to have just a broader voice. And for him, that made sense that some things he wanted to come from the CMG level versus living within each of the individual brands. And so he asked me, he and I met and, through a series of conversations, and he asked me if I wanted to come and help him lead inclusion and diversity from the CMG level. What that means, though, is that, of course, we want all of the individual brands to continue to maintain their individual cultures, their sort of individual, sense of who they are and identity. But we wanted to have a unifying point of view around inclusion and diversity that came from CMG. So in my new role, what I really focus on is what is that unifying point of view? What are some kind of execution milestones that we want all of the agencies to try to meet over the course of, the year and beyond? And how can I really be a support, a strategic resource for our individual agencies within CMG, and how can I provide subject matter expertise, some centralized resources, and also really drive collaboration for this work across all of the agencies in the way that Andy envisions. So my role is really focused on all of those things.
And have you actually done any of the new role pre-COVID, or did you start the new role sort of within this lockdown situation? That must have been a bit crazy.
It was. I actually took on the role beginning January 2020. So
Okay.
It was just enough time for us to begin conversations and for me to start to develop that point of view. It was important that we develop that, sort of strategy point of view along with the brands. And so we were sort of in the midst of establishing that, having those conversations, and really starting to put, pencil to paper to come up with the things we wanted to do. And boom, March 11th, 12th, 13th hit, and things are absolutely derailed.
Yeah, and that's why we're doing this interview in our respective, well, you're in your kitchen, by the look of it, and I'm in my living room. And but actually quite like it. It's funny how the innovation sort of comes out of situations like this, and you just think, well, actually, why don't we just do it like this? And in fact, why don't we do a news feature like this, Coffee Break?
Yeah, actually, it's on theme here, exactly.
Yeah. So look, obviously we can't talk about diversity and inclusion without talking about the wider social situation at the moment. We're recording this on Tuesday, sort of eight days after the murder of George Floyd. Just the most distressing thing that anyone can ever have seen, but especially people in the Black community have seen this over and over again, over not just this year, but over the generations. How do you place what you're doing and your diversity and inclusion role within the wider social context, and what's your take on it?
Yeah, that's the question of the day, right? And I think there's so much for us to learn here. We really, when we were focused on COVID, one of the pieces that we wrote is that what are the lessons from COVID-19 that we can use to help us realize the promise of inclusion and diversity in corporate America. And within the context of the COVID crisis, what was clear to us is that systemic inequities, no matter what form they're in, those systemic inequities for Black people, for Asian people, for those who are medically and financially vulnerable, they have a concrete downstream impact. Right. So these are things that, we talk about inequities sort of as this concept or sort of as a philosophy. And we don't always have as much evidence as we would like about how those equities impact the lives, both from a professional setting and in a personal setting for the individuals impacted. COVID gave us a lot of that concrete data and a lot of those examples. And so, what we really wanted to do was use those lessons to start to reevaluate the way that systemic inequities might play out within our environment. Obviously, some of those impacts aren't as dire. People are not dying in corporate America, but the inequities absolutely have a concrete impact on people's careers and the way that people operate within an organization, how long they stay at an organization, whether or not they're able to join in the first place. And so, from a COVID perspective, we were really looking to tie those things together for the sake of driving change and having individual brands really rethink their values, their purpose, and take a hard look at the way they were operating. When the news of George Floyd hit, and I think even more apropos, the example of Amy Cooper, who was the executive in Central Park, who was asked to leash her dog in the ramble. When those examples hit, sort of as bookends, what that gave us is another concrete example of how our system continues to disadvantage one group of people, in this case, Black people. And our opportunity became intensified, it became more stark, and it became even more tragic. And so what we've been talking about with Andy and all of the CEOs across our agencies within CMG is, how do we come to understand how consistently one group of people can be impacted by in this nature in our world? And again, how do we think about the way we evaluate our internal systems, and how do we make changes so that we can make sure we are not replicating some of the same systemic issues over and over again within our own organizations? And so those are tough questions for any organization to ask. But, frankly, in the context of COVID and in the context of, the most recent tragedies around, systemic inequities in the justice system, and, even, like I said, the example of Amy Cooper and the park, we would be remiss as inclusion and diversity practitioners not to ask those questions and not to think about that context with the work that we're doing.
Yeah, it's almost like a perfect storm, isn't it? Because if you think of 40 million extra people have been on the unemployment register over the last 10 weeks, over 100,000 people have died. Those impacts have been harder faced by the Black, Hispanic, Asian American communities for a number of reasons, poverty being one of them, more likely to be working in essential roles, living in more crowded parts of the city. And actually, the irony of all this is that the true heroes of this, are people in mass transit going, people, delivery drivers, garbage truckers, health service workers, where people are much more, the Black community is much more represented, and everyone's being on their rooftops or outside on the street at 7 p.m. every night clapping, and there's new respect for people doing, essential jobs, but that were probably done slightly unrecognized in the past. And then something like this just piles on top of it. And for people in the Black community, it must be, when is this going to end? When's this going to change? And having to, I guess there's also fatigue in having to explain this to white people who are allies, but are well-meaning, but don't necessarily know how to respond to this. What would your message be there and to wider business, because as we've seen with the Amy Cooper incidents, that's a so-called educated professional senior person in a corporate setting where you would have thought that that sort of attitude would just not exist anymore.
Well, where you would hope, right? But you know, I think that that example in particular is most instructive for our environment, because I think we've gotten to the point, in some ways, that you know we continually kind of separate ourselves or divorce ourselves from some of the more sensational examples that we see, right? So people ask the questions like, what was he doing? Why were the police so harsh? Or there's some, indication that there was wrongdoing that could somehow justify the result that we saw with George Floyd, even as it's before us. So I like to use the example of Amy Cooper because I believe that that is more often the way that those things happen in corporate America. You have someone who holds a set of beliefs, who is in a position of power, and you have to ask yourself, what decisions did she make? What decisions did she influence about an individual, about their career, about whether or not someone was hired, whether or not someone was promoted, who she put around her, who did she influence, younger, people who looked up to her. And those become really daunting questions, but important questions for leaders to ask, because we hold our leaders accountable for the culture that we build, right? And so to the extent that you have someone as senior as she is, you have to believe that some of those beliefs somehow were also expressed in other ways throughout the corporation. And, what I would say to all of our corporate leadership is, number one, take a stand. Number one, take a stand, really see what's happening in the world and decide, is this something that you want to speak out on? How are you going to support your employees if you don't? Really understand that this is a system of events that consistently result in one group being in some way disadvantaged. The other thing we say is time to take a look at your values, your purpose, your mission. Make sure that what you're putting forward, that you're living. This is a time when companies are going to be examined for what they put out, so make sure it's authentic. And it's a time when companies are going to be called to task. You see from a market perspective that, the African American community, the Latino community, there's just more and more buying power. The demographic shifts are absolutely happening. And these are people who want to see brands whose insides match their outsides. If you're going after that diverse dollar, that Black dollar, that Hispanic dollar, these communities are going to know that corporations are upholding values and holding people accountable to principles of equity and values of inclusion if they want their dollars. The other thing that brands really need to do is think about what needs to change. Take a hard look at our leadership and see what their beliefs are. And it's fair to ask the question, right? If what we're saying to people is, within this organization, our leaders will behave in this way. That is what is acceptable. That is what will be our conditions for promotion, our conditions for success, and then hold leaders accountable for living those. And the system has to be put in place so leaders like the Amy Coopers of the world cannot continue to be successful and lead an organization the size of Franklin Templeton.
Yeah, no, well said. We've got about a minute left, and corporate response, we've seen the way brands have responded and corporations have responded. Everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people putting messages out. Just quick, what's the advice to leaders? Because you can't fake purpose and you can't fake authenticity. What's your advice to them in terms of responding to this situation?
I'd say absolutely be authentic. Don't make a claim that you can't back up. And I say, if you're brand new at this, or you've made mistakes in the past, just say that. Say, we know something now that we wish we would have known sooner, and we're prepared to act this way going forward. The best example I'll use quickly is what Netflix did. Netflix came out in support of their creators, their actors, but they have a track record to support that. They support Ava DuVernay, Shonda Rhimes, Kenya Burris, all the Obamas are on that platform, many comedians. So, they have the authentic track record to support it. say something, but make sure it's authentic.
Yeah, thank you for that, Margenett. It was great to chat to you. Thanks for joining Coffee Break, and wish you well in the future with that role. And
Yes, thank you.
we can move beyond this as a society, and because there's so many great people in America that want to, that make it such a great society. So, and we've got to just push those folks have got to stand up and lead and seek the future that we want to have for everybody.
Yeah, let this be the beginning of that, Steve. Thank you for having me.
Take care.
You too.